This one will be focusing on river bass. The fish, and we're very lucky to have around us. I can't really think of anywhere else in the world that the smallmouth fishing kind of compares to the diversity of the fishery, the size of our fish, and the amount of them in Ontario. So we're very fortunate. There's a lot of places when, we fish for trout. Oh, I wish I was in Montana, or we're fishing for steelhead. I wish I was in BC. Well, there's nowhere to wish, better fishing than in Ontario for smallmouth. So they're really high up there and one of my favorite fish to catch. They're very agreeable most days. They can be moody. I don't know any other fish out there that gets more affected from a cold front than the smallmouth. But they fight hard, they jump, they get big, and they take surface flies just as well as they take stuff off the bottom. So they're really just an everyday person's kind of fish. Lots of fun, get strong, and there's lots of them. So we're gonna jump on into it. I'm hoping to get through 5 patterns tonight. I've done a few presentations on bass, and so has one of my good friends, Nick. So I was trying to dig through what flies haven't I shared yet, which, it's kind of funny, kind of a challenge to dig through those and see what I haven't shared. But I've got 5 that I haven't shared with anyone yet, besides clients in my boat. A couple of them are my own patterns, and then some of them are some older school patterns that still get a lot of use, and some somewhat newer ones. So my goal right now is we're going to start on the surface and work our way to the bottom. Smallmouth can be heavily oriented on the surface. Everyone's probably seen lots of slow motion videos of them hitting poppers. Super fun. So you got to start there some days. I'm not going to get into too much like of the in-depth on how to fish, each, it's not like a fishery presentation, but I will talk as we tie. But if you have questions on how to fish them or where you should present them, just shoot them out in the comment box. Chris will get them over to me and I'll answer them live. So I'm going to spin my camera around, and where are we? Perfect. And we're going to start off with the Zud Bubbler, a pretty standard, well, it's kind of the Zud Bubbler. I don't use the official Zud Bubbler head, but it's the same idea. It's a closed cell foam bass popper. It's not a hard foam, so it's nice and soft. When the fish grabs it, it feels squishy, which I think makes a big difference sometimes on the hookup rate. Just like I've noticed fishing, hard, for instance, if I'm not going to be a purist by any means, fishing beads for steelhead, they often hit them and spit them before you can set the hook because they're solid and hard. So the bass popper foam heads that are hard, I find a lot of times the fish hits it, smacks it, they instantly spit it out. They don't give it a chance. These ones that are very squishy tend to let the fish hold on to them a bit more. They're also a little bit different popping sound. They're a bit more of a push of water versus a pop. Those loud pops, cup face poppers are great. Don't let me get you wrong. But sometimes the subtleness of the push of the water is a little bit more realistic, and the fish key in on them. When it comes to colors, I like dark with high contrast, so black and orange, black and red. I'd be lying if I didn't say chartreuse is on my line 80% of the time fishing for them. It's a great color. It stands out in all watercolors, and it just looks real. And then one that I have a lot of fun with, and depends on the time of year, is a damselfly imitation with an extended body. And actually, for the legs, I use the, what do you call it? The lateral line, lateral scale material. So it's very rigid, and it's got a very clicky wing sound. So this is actually really deadly when you start seeing those blue damselflies and dragonflies skating across the surface. Sometimes the bass really key in on them. But for the purpose of tonight's presentation, I'm going to tie the black and orange. It's one of my go-tos. It's high contrast, it's easy to see on camera, and it just looks really fishy. So we'll get into this. Really, I want to start making sure that my patterns are for a variety of skills. I don't want them all just to be hard. So this is a nice simple pattern to get started off with. So basically for hooks, I like a size 1. One of my standard hooks I'm using are just the O'Shaughnessy's. They kind of do everything. They're, not cheap, but they're inexpensive. They're strong. They're going to hold up to fish. They're going to hold up to big fish. And you get nice big packs of them, 25 for $12. So it's a pretty good deal. And it's only a few materials, so it's really straightforward. I'm going to start my thread in, and you want to make a pretty good thread base for where your popper is going to go, because you need that thread there to glue on the popper head. The nice thing about these two is they're a really quick tie. So we were talking briefly before about deer hair, and deer hair is great, but it is a lot of work sometimes to keep up with it and tie a dozen of them. So these you can crank out a dozen real quick. For the legs, you can use really, or for the tail, you can pretty much use anything. I like just a black neck hackle tied in opposing so that it creates kind of like a little V, like little legs in the water, has a lot of movement. So I'm going to take 4 of them out of there. All right. And you want them to be pretty short. You don't want them to be like super long. I'd say like a little, maybe a little bit longer than the hook itself. Somewhere, maybe a little shorter than that even. Yeah, somewhere in there. Pull back your fibers to get a nice clean tie-in point. I always like to start on the far side of the shank. Hold it tight with your left hand to keep it in the right orientation, and then wrap up, and then you should be good. And then I'm going to do the near side. Put the same. The key is just to push in with your thumb to keep that orientation. If you don't, it's going to rotate on the shank. It'll still work, but it's not as pretty. And I'll double up. So 2 on each side. Give it a little bit more profile. And if you lose a hackle or 2 in the process of fishing, that's okay. And I'm purposely trapping in all these other fibers. It makes it a little bit more bushy. And I'm just going to trim these all fairly close. Okay. And then I'm going to build up that thread, pull everything back. Okay, there we go. And one thing you can get really carried away with on flies is a lot of flash. So I like to keep it fairly subtle. Just going to use some red flash. This one's pretty well picked through, but I got enough in here to get me through. Only going to grab, I don't know, 4 or so strands. We're going to double it up in there. So we'll have.
Sorry, that was just to make sure I have it right. That was the S74 mustad. Is that right?
S71.
S71. Sorry.
S71, yeah, 2x heavy, 1x long.
Yeah.
And then right on top of the hook shank, in between the hackle, I'm going to tie in a couple loose wraps. Well, just let the bobbin hang so that I can get the thread out of the way. Right between the legs, so it kind of goes right down the middle. You can put it off to the sides as well, but this seems to work well for me. And I was going to trim it roughly to right length. Perfect. All right, so really simple. Next is some orange neck hackle. Find one that's kind of webby, not quite schlappen, but got those webby longer base fibers. It helps contour the fly properly and lets it flow. Nice transition into the tail. And then I'm going to use about half the feather, I think. So I'm going to pull back somewhere around there. That should be enough to fill in the gap. Reverse, put the tip forward. I'm going to tie in tip first, because that way the shorter fibers, the stiffer fibers will be towards the back, which will prop up the longer fibers. And then just like any kind of soft hackle, just pull those fibers back and wrap. And I couldn't, I would not want to be tying a bomber like this, I'll tell you that. Good work, Jordan. All right, so Finish that off with a couple thread wraps. And that's that. We're going to try to just cover all the bases. I usually kind of go back on the neck hackle a little bit just to give it a little bit more shape, but also keeps it from breaking. And cover up all those bare spots you see on the hook. And this is it. We're going to do a simple whip finish. Just single one's good enough because we're going to glue this up pretty good. As for the head, you can buy the Zud Bubbler heads pre-cut, which is awesome. They're super effective and they work great. This is just some like 7mm floor foam that I've cut into little triangles. It works good too. It doesn't have the exact same shape and profile of the proper Zud Bubbler heads, but it seems to work good for me. Either way, you can do one of two ways to thread it. You can punch a hole through the middle and actually slide it on kind of like that. Or the quicker way for me is just slice it in the bottom and we'll just glue it up. So I did that. I sliced it in the bottom. I'm going to take some crazy glue, Zap-A-Gap, whatever you got. Put on a decent amount on the top. Kind of work it around a little bit. Now, there it is. Okay. Then what I like to do, it's gonna be tricky with the camera, is I try to like spread it open and then like get it right around the hook and then pinch it so that the bottom closes up. Try not to zap your fingers. And then take something like a bodkin and you can just kind of get rid of the excess. And you see the bottom sealed right up. It's not going to come off anytime soon. Clean off this bodkin because I need it in a minute. There we go. All right. Then the super simple way of attaching rubber legs that I like to do. There we go. So get yourself whatever kind of rubber leg color you like that can kind of go with the color of your fly. It can contrast. I'm always a fan of the silicone flat cut versus the round rubber. This stuff doesn't rot and fall off your flies unexpectedly if it's been sitting in your box for a year. So it lasts a lot longer. What I like to do to put the rubber legs on, so I'm gonna take my bodkin and I'm gonna punch a hole kind of, if I'm gonna put the eye kind of here and put the rubber legs down and below, I'm gonna punch a hole through the foam, give it a couple pulls back and forth to add some friction, heat up that hole. Then you can take like a bobbin threader or some wire bite from pike fishing, which works great. Double it up. You can stick it through your hole. Grab your rubber legs, and I don't think you need to be shy with rubber legs. Like I'm grabbing 5 usually, 5 to 6. Like I want it to be pretty healthy. And then I'm going to cut off just that little piece on the top. And then I guess you probably could have threaded it through first, actually, would have been a little bit easier. There we go. Okay, and then you're just gonna basically pull the wire to get them to come through. And there should be lots of friction. That way you know you've got enough in there. Yeah. I actually often don't even glue them in there. They stay in. I find also if you add glue, I'm just gonna cut these all flush. The material can get really brittle and actually break. So those are about 1.5 inches. So I'm gonna do the same on this side. And you can center it after. At this point, a couple more dabs of crazy glue for your eyes. And we all know the first thing to fall off on these flies is the eyes, but I carry extras just like when I'm pike fishing, and that bottle of glue rides in my fly box, and you can attach more if you really care. I don't think they're too important on this fly because often they don't see the eye, but it gives me more confidence, and that's all that matters. There you go. So what is that, like a 4-minute tie, less 3-minute tie, something like that? Really fast, super deadly, easy to cast. One great thing about this style popper, when it lands softly. It doesn't land with a big splash like some of the heavier foam ones, hard body foam ones, I should say. In a river, when it comes to fishing poppers, it's the way everybody wants to catch a bass. I'll just start there. Like everyone's excited to catch them on the surface, and I don't blame you. However, 90% of the time, no, 80% of the time, it's not the most effective way, but it is still, I mean, one bass on the surface is like equal to a lot more underneath sometimes. The thing about these though, just like I guess most flies or most streamer fishing kind of thing, the closer you can get these to the bank, the better on your cast. So, or the structure you're fishing, if that's a log or the rock pile, get it right up in there. Not only can this be mistaken for like a small bait fish on the surface, but a lot of time it's amphibians, small rodents. There's been documented cases where bass, like especially largemouth, have small ducks and birds in their belly too, right? So a lot of things to eat. Could be a dragonfly, could be anything. And it just, I think, enacts that predatory response. Something splashing and looking on the surface like I'm in trouble, I'm gonna come up and eat it. Smallmouth tend to be pretty voracious. So super simple fly. You can get a lot of these tied in an hour and you're gonna catch a ton of fish. The great thing too is I always bring extra heads because they will eventually fall off and you can just put a new head on in the boat because this body is gonna last. Like hackle's pretty tough with that stem. Eventually, after a dozen bass, this head could get loose. It's on there pretty good right now, but it might fall off. So carry extra heads if you want to. Fishing the poppers, I like to fish them in a little bit slower water. I guess like most of my bass fishing is done in slower water than trout fishing in rivers. I think that's one thing a lot of individuals when they first start bass fishing in rivers fail to realize is that they're not trout. And they want to fish that trouty water, those riffles and the nice pocket water and all that kind of stuff. And sure, you'll get the odd fish. But if you look at the way a bass is built, it's designed to be in slower water. They're a lion weight predator. They're not so much just sitting out in the current feeding on drifting nymphs. They will do that, but majority of the time they're tucked up in cover waiting for something to swim too close to them. So find a lot of like back eddies, swirls, still water that has the foam collecting near moving water, not fast water, but not near to the fast water. It has to be moving, but not completely still. So you don't want to be in a completely lake environment. You do want some movement, but fishing these in the still portions. Make sure when your popper lands to give it a few seconds. Don't start stripping right away. The old saying would wait for the rings to disappear before you pop it. And then don't overwork poppers. Cast them out, let them sit, give them a pop, wait for the fish, like, 3, 4, 5 seconds in between pops sometimes, even more. It can be what it takes. So yeah, I just saw that one question. Yeah, so you guys actually sell the proper Zud bubbler heads. I use them, they're awesome. These are just made out of floor mats like otherwise stated, but there's lots of options out there. But either way, I like a soft foam. I find the fish hold on to it longer. It's got a different sounding pop. And they're quick and easy to tie. You don't have to paint them, like they're just simple. So
yeah,
cool.
It's a great fly. Really like it. And yeah, like, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was gonna comment that like yeah, I would pay attention to the kind of foam that you use. Like you're saying, like different foams will land and pop differently, different sounds depending on how dense they are. So you can probably use like almost any foam as long as it floats, but you may want to play around, figure out what creates the sound you want.
Yeah, definitely. In the shape you cut it, like having a blunt face like this is one thing. I've played with them with like making little divers in them, and like I guess it'd be more like a slider than a diver, like that. But I always like a flat face popper. I don't know, that pushes a lot of water without being too loud. When you watch bait fish on the surface doing their thing, it's usually pretty inconspicuous. Like it's not like you hear a pop, pop, right? It's a nice, like a little splash, and like maybe you see the rings more than you hear it because you catch it in your vision. The same kind of thing with bass. One cool thing with these two is to give them like vibrations, like give them little twitches. Don't feel like you got to pop it on a 6-inch or a 1-foot pull every time. Little 1-foot pops to imitate like a dragonfly stuck in the surface film. That'll just make those legs quiver and really just make it look like a dragonfly in distress. Dragonflies aren't always on the menu, but when they get stuck in the surface film, they definitely are. So yeah, That's a nice simple popper. Anybody can whip up with, if you can basically tie a woolly bugger, it's very similar, you know, like put a marabou tail on there and wrap some hackle and away you go. So it's a good one.
Awesome. Love it.
Cool. So keeping on the train of going from high to low, I think the clouser's been tied before, but I'm not sure if the half and half's been tied before. It's another one of, it's an old school fly, made by the same individual, Lefty Cray, and excuse me. Oh gosh, help me out here. Why am I blanking? I just had his name. Thank you. Clouser, obviously. Lefty and Bob, they took both their flies, so Lefty's Deceiver and Bob Clouser, and they combined them into one. And it's a super effective fly. The one thing that I'm taking this to another little different level would be even, I don't know if it's even more old school, but tying it bend back style. You guys haven't tied, I don't think we've had these tied before, have we on here? I don't think so.
Not yet, not on this channel.
Sweet. The cool thing about bend backs is it's like kind of like the Texas rigging of fly fishing. So you notice all that stiff bucktail and hackle and peacock feather are all over top of the hook point. So that hook point's protected. So if you fished with me, and you know, I briefly talked about getting it close to the structure, especially when we're fishing downed wood. One of the rivers I fish a lot for bass has a lot of lumber in it, and it can be easy to hook up, you know, getting in that lumber, but the fish are also in there. So fishing this style fly will avoid the amount of foul hookups you get on bottom. Clouser in general is pretty snag resistant in most of the times, but with that hook point hidden, it's even less foulable. So I know they probably make, I know they make proper bend back hooks, but when you look them up online, a lot of people are recommending is making your own out of whatever you got. So one thing, the fluke hook I really love is a stinger hook for this. The shape of it, while the stinger was traditionally designed more for like deer hair bugs with that really steep upturn point, so you could wrap like a weed guard around it. It works great for this because once you bend the hook eye, that point almost ends up in line with the lead eyes, with it on an open angle too, as you can see. It's not directly in line, so that way you don't miss strikes. If this ends up in a fish's mouth, it's going to get hooked. So you're not really going to miss too many fish, unlike some Texas rig hooks, like even when I've been conventional fishing, I'll open up the bend on those hooks a little bit just so that they have somewhere to go instead of just a straight pull out of the mouth. So super deadly fly, little twist on the clouser. So what I like to do to start off is I'm going to take my 1/0 stinger. I'm going to put it in my vise about, let's say, 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit more. And I'm just going to put it in so the hook point's kind of towards me. And I'm just going to apply a little bit of downward pressure. Don't get carried away because you will snap hooks and you'll hurt yourself. So just a little bit of pressure slowly, and that'll end up with your nice shape that you're looking for. So, you know, it's not directly in line with where the eyes are. That way, when you pull it forward, that's going to go up into the fish's mouth. Most of the time, they're hooked in the roof of the mouth on this fly. All right, so to get started, let me just find my bobbin. What the heck? You ever do that? Put something down. Put something down, and it's just like, I swear, I just had it. I'm just going to change over thread colors because I'm tying a chartreuse and white fly. Might as well use chartreuse thread. Fly like a clouser has a pretty obvious thread head, so I like to match it or get a complementing color. Other flies, you can keep the thread head small, but with the nature of bucktail, it's going to create a bit of a larger head. So I like to have a matching color. So I'm going to start with the hook in this orientation, starting my thread at the bend. And what I like to do is I like to wrap way down the flat section. We're going to add in a little bit of flash wrap on the shank. So same as I was talking about before, that lateral scale, really good material for anything. Like, I love it as a body wrap. I love it as a winging material. We're going to use it as a body material and in the wing. So we're going to use one strand wrapped up and just touching, well, overlapping turns really. It's also a pretty durable material compared to a lot of other tinsels I find. Like it's pretty rigid. And that crinkle has just got a nice color to it. You can, if you'd really like to make it extra durable, run some like Solaris thin or something over top, which I will sometimes do. I'm not going to do that now, but you totally could if you want. So you get a little bit of flash on the shank. That's totally an extra step if you want to or not. For me, it's tends to be a little bit of a confidence move. I find with my fish flies that have that fish better. I'm going to reposition my hook in the vise, and now because I'm tying on the next flat surface, I want to make that section flat. We're going to create a little bump, just like if you watch, I believe Nick was the one maybe who tied a clouser on here. He talks about it. Create a small bump behind, go forward a few turns, create another small bump in front. And that is going to really allow your eyes to lock in, and they will not spin, and they will stand up to the abuse. We're going to use a large eye on this. I want this fly to get down quick. Say just like large red, yellow. Red and yellow tend to be my go-tos. I don't know why, but they both are good colors. Sometimes a black, depending on the pattern. And what you're going to do now, if you can see it, there's two little bumps. They're not big at all, with a small gap of bare hook in between. I'm going to put that right in between the two bumps, do a couple wraps over top, and then X wrap a couple times. And then right around the bottom, like you're tying in a parachute post, kind of, and pull towards the hook point. Don't pull down. That's not the direction we want. We want to pull the thread this way to like choke up on all those wraps underneath. And then a couple more over top. The worst thing with clousers is when your lead eyes start to spin and you're just like, you feel like you just have no confidence in that fly anymore. So I can like take that and almost torque the hook, which is nice. I like the way that one tied in. So next thing we're going to do is take more neck hackle and find 4 somewhat symmetrical pieces. It's not super important, but I like to find hackles that are straight, that aren't too twisted, that aren't too long and have some good mass towards the base. I don't want them to be super skinny all the way throughout. And often I'll tie too long and too kind of slightly shorter. So it creates a good taper. All right. So I'm going to take my feathers, and by straight, you just want them a little bit curved, that's okay. But the best ones you can find in your bunch that will lay out about 2.5 hooks long, roughly. It's a pretty long fly. I'm going to pull off all the fuzzy butts. Same kind of thing we did just a second ago. Apply pressure to the hook shank with your thumb. Tied in. Oh, see it twisted a little bit. Don't want that. Unwrap. Sometimes you have to play with the feather itself and actually flatten the stem with like the back of your scissors or something. Will help you flatten it. All right, that's better. Cool. Prep the other one. Go on the other side. Yeah, roughly the same length. Perfect. They laid up nicely, right along each other. Now I'm going to take 2 that are slightly shorter. Not, again, the end of the world if it is the same length, but you notice that one's about 1 inch shorter. It'll create some good taper and allow those hackle to really start to vibrate and create some good movement on your fly. Because you haven't, it's kind of like building up, if anybody's watched any proper intruder tying films, sometimes you cannot tie things in too bulky and they won't have a lot of movement. So tying things in somewhat sparse. When it comes to feathers or any real fly that you want to dance, if it's a little bit more sparse, you'll get more movement. All right, so we've got 4 hackles, 2 on each side. Got all these butts here. What I like to do is I'm going to take my thread slightly forward and capture those butts in front of the eyes too. That'll just stop you from losing hackles. All right, so I'm going to go back to that lateral scale. We're going to run a strand on each side. You can overdo it with the lateral scale quite a bit, I find. So make sure you're not doing that. Just like 1 per side is usually enough. So actually start that wrap in front of the eye, just again for security. And then come behind, just put it in the right orientation. And then bring that one up around. See how much, like 1 piece of lateral scale is probably equivalent to a lot more in regular Flashabou in terms of what kind of look you're going for. So I'm going to bend those fibers up on the tail a little bit just to get them the right orientation. And there we go. Cool. Now it's basically like tying a clouser. So if anybody's read anything from Bob Clouser, one of his favorites was white and chartreuse. So let's keep along that train because it's one of my favorites as well. With bucktail, I don't know about you, Chris, but I don't really stack the bucktail for clousers. I like them being tapered.
Yeah, I mean, dirty secret, I don't really stack hair for almost anything.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, I'm just lazy.
That's fair. So I like that natural kind of varied length. I think it creates better profile. Doesn't maybe look as fishy to us, but it looks better in the water. I see a lot of people stacking clouser hair when tying, and sure, it looks great, but I like having that natural. You can see how there's like fibers getting longer as you go throughout the length. I'll usually pull out the longest of the long just to make it a little bit more symmetrical. And then I'm going to tie this in about 3/4 the length of the feather. I don't want this to be super short, although that would probably work, but I definitely don't want this the length of the fly because that's going to hinder any movement you get from the hackle. So at this point, I'm going to take my thread forward and I'm going to lay that down. The white on the bottom, most bait fish are light colored on the bottom and dark towards the top. And I'm going to pinch this behind the eyes and apply a loose wrap or 2. Position my hair, and then I'm just going to pull down to kind of lock it in. And then wrap back behind the eyes with a couple wraps, and then space out another couple wraps and leave a little bit of a gap there. With a regular clouser, I'll usually do this 4 or 5 times down the shank of the hook. I don't know if it makes any difference. I like the look of it. I think it's kind of cool seeing the crosshatch thread through at the back of the fly. It probably has a lot to do with the way the fly stops hair from fouling on the hook when casting, but this will just help keep the orientation. And then come forward and then trim your butts as close as you can to the hook eye, but on an angle. It'll allow you to lay down a nice thread base. Oh, I trimmed it too short. Look at that. A couple of them came loose. That's all right. And admit it, just cut them. Because that's the benefit too of tying behind the eye. If you do something like that, they're still locked in. They're not going anywhere. And most of the time your fly will end up looking like that after a couple passes anyways. So there you go. Then instead of it just being a traditional white and chartreuse, I like to incorporate white, yellow, and chartreuse in my clouser. So we'll use a yellow bucktail now. I should mention when you're selecting hairs for your bucktail, this bucktail broke on me, which is pretty common in the dyed colors. The natural ones have more flexibility to them. Like when they're just white, you can flex them out quite a bit, but the dyed ones tend to be kind of brittle. I want to take hair from toward the tip of the bucktail because that's not going to have any is the word hollowness. There's no hollow hair towards the tip. It's all solid. It won't flare like spinning deer hair when you're wanting to tie that in. So I tied in about a pencil diameter just to be able to get the bottom. Now, because I'm adding 2 colors, I'm going to tie in about half the amount of each color to get the same amount of volume. I saw that question come through briefly. Yes, there you go. That's the answer. If it wraps around the back of the hook, it just doesn't allow for the same presentation you're looking for. Same thing can happen with like zonker strips and stuff. So what I like to do now is, because I want to envision, like, you can put it up against the hook like that, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to pull my hair watching the hook point down and around the bend of the hook for the most part, get 90% of the fibers. That way I can line them up with the white fibers underneath. And I'm going to start the back again, couple loose wraps, snug, couple loose wraps, snug. I'm not going to trim just yet. I'll do that after I tie in my chartreuse. This one's getting really picked through at the tips, but I think I got just enough chartreuse left in here for another dozen flies or so. I probably could just throw this one color clouser or half and half all year and be completely happy. It's on my rod most of the time. Same kind of thing, pull it through. Okay, now you're gonna pull those up and trim those the best you can. A couple of them wandered around. That's okay, just snip them out of the way. All right, I'm liking the profile on this, which is good. Thicker towards the top will help the orientation of the fly while it swims. I'm gonna try to wrap up a few of these butts. And before I finish, it's not necessary at all, but I like taking peacock herl. Peacock herl is a nice natural iridescence. It creates a nice olive color on the back. A lot of bait fish have, most bait fish, if you find the darkest point of them, it's going to be on their back. So let's add on, I don't know, 7 or 8 strands. Like, don't be shy. With peacock herl, I'm doing this behind the camera. I'm going to try to, try to line up the tips the best I can. It can be kind of hard because they come in varied length. Pull out the shortest of the short. And then just hand stack them. Sorry, I realized I was doing that off camera. Okay, that's pretty good. Perfect. And then you tie them in the length of your bucktail. Brush them around the hook just to make sure it's the right length. And we're going to secure them right to the top of the hook with some wraps. And then those get trimmed too. Head got a little bit crazy on me. That's okay. Lots of thread wraps will help shoot that fly and make it more durable. And then this is kind of a 2 whip finish fly at least. And then I don't usually skimp on head cement on clousers. I don't use much head cement otherwise, like with trout flies and stuff, they don't usually get any anymore. But with these large tapered thread heads, the thread wants to wander down. So there we go. Cool thing about this versus a regular clouser, because of the way the hook is oriented, let's move this back into the vise so you can see it. It creates like a deep belly profile on the fly. So it looks a lot like river baitfish. The regular clouser, or whatever, if it's not a bend back, looks a lot like, let's say, an emerald shiner or any other lake baitfish. But if you look in a river, most of the baitfish, river shiners, or what are called common shiners technically, are deep bodied. So this creates that large, deep profile of what the bass are generally eating. And that little extra flash is kind of hidden in under the belly. And yeah, super deadly fly. Good baitfish profile from all sides. And it's always going to ride, for the most part, hook up like this and completely hidden in that bucktail. So super effective fly with a tying technique that isn't so front and center anymore. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but bend back's not as common anymore as it used to be.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're talking about. Like, you don't see a lot of trout or bass flies maybe being tied with it, but definitely a resurgence with pike and muskie angles, I would say. And a lot of activity there. But like, I mean, there's some awesome just like river trout streams, like some of the original like big trout streamers are tied bend back style. And
Yeah, I'm thinking like Thunder Creeks and stuff that are tied bend back and things like that. They were,
yeah, stuff like that for sure. And you can tie any streamer pretty well that way. Sure.
definitely. It's just like the Texas rigging of the fly world a little bit. It also is great because I'm talking about being heavy cover, like wood and rock for snag proof. One thing I didn't mention is sometimes there's a lot of really thin weeds or like moss in a river, or like almost like a slime that's on the rocks. And this is really good at avoiding getting it on the hook, because that's going to slip right through that stuff and not foul your fly, which is frustrating when you don't notice at first and you've been throwing it for 20 casts and there's moss all over it.
Yeah, that's good insight. Sure.
I should say, if you're not catching fish, just check your fly. Unlike conventional, our flies always at least 9-10 feet away from us. And if you're picking it up, back casting without looking at your fly every 30-40 casts, you're not getting bites. There's probably something on your fly, especially if someone else in your boat or you're fishing with is getting fish. Bass tend to be schooling predators, and usually not too picky, but if there's a good amount of green slime hanging off the back, they're probably not going to take it. It does bring me one memory about fishing this fly in particular, is if you're fishing two people from a boat, or if you're close together while walking, just make sure you're paying attention when someone hooks up, because they are such a schooling fish. Usually they're very susceptible to being caught and getting doubles when one is hooked up. You might see, there was one day I was out, I was actually out with the SoFly guys, and I can't remember if it was Yilma. I think it was Yilma. He had a fish on, and I think there was 4 separate bass following. And we actually ended up hooking up and doubling up, and then we kept that fish in the water and got a second fish too. So it was like 3 fish because one fish was hooked. It's kind of wild. You can fish a large section of river that has bass in it, that river has bass, and not catch a fish, and then all of a sudden feel like you found them all. And they do, because they are such a schooling fish at times. They're not as territorial as, say, a big brown trout, where it's one fish at that log and spread out throughout the river. Often you'll float. There's one river in particular in my mind that the first kilometer of the river will fish it, but I always tell people it's a bonus fish. It's not my go-to. And then once you get to the midsection of my float, there's 4 or 5 pools, and every bass we're going to catch is going to be in those 4 or 5 pools out of like a 10 or 15 kilometer float. So yeah, don't at least from my experience, they're not always super territorial. They don't mind getting close to each other, even big fish.
Is there a time of year you prefer to fish those bait fish kind of patterns?
Oh, okay, great question. So I mean, the great thing about bait fish is they're almost always on the menu. Unlike some of my next flies, like certain crayfish, which are only on the menu first, they're always there, but there's prime seasons for crayfish. I'll start fishing these pretty much from opening to closing day. The main difference is the color selection and how I fish it. So usually I'll fish a bright one like this, white or bright, and a dark one, whether that's black and blue, olive, things like that. Those would be kind of the 2 that are going. We'll start off the day, if we're not sure, with one person throwing each. The old adage of bright fly, bright day, I mean, it's usually a starting point for me. It doesn't mean it's always going to be that way, but I usually start that way. And you just get them early in the season. I'm going to fish these early in the season. So I should also mention river bass fishing for me doesn't really tend to heat up until kind of late July. The water temps in the rivers are so much lower than the lakes, so the spawn in the rivers can happen later. Keep that in mind as well. So you don't obviously want to be catching spawning fish, but also they just don't seem to be as aggressive until middle to late July. And then I start fishing them quick. So, the water's in the 70s. I'm fishing them pretty fast, giving them a 2-second count before I start stripping, and nice 12-inch strips. But as I get later into the season, specifically when we're out steelheading and we're going through a bassy section, I'll get someone to throw a clouser at log jams, and I'll make them count it down for 10-15 seconds, like get it right down to the bottom. And then it's a nice slow and steady 1 to 2 foot strip, just to keep it moving. But yeah, the great thing about a clouser or any baitfish style fly is you can likely throw it out there at any time of the year and probably catch fish. The half and half tends to be quite a bit longer. It's about as small as I would tie half and half. That's about 4 inches. Clousers you can tie down to like, I've caught fish on like size 8 clousers, like super small, 1.5 inches long. So don't be afraid to change bait fish profile as well as the season progresses. Early in the season, starting smaller and getting bigger as the season goes on is always a good thing to think of as well as the bait fish grow. Yeah, I don't know if anything else I'd cover on that fly specifically, but let the fish tell you what they want. Don't feel like you have to fish it fast. That's key. Count them down. And I should say about countdown, start with a 2-second countdown, then do a 3-second, then do a 4, and then kind of remember what you were on when you caught your first fish. I always say if one fish is a fluke, but if you can repeat that success, if you caught it on a countdown of 6 on your strip, do 6 again, nothing, nothing, nothing. Okay, now you're at 9. Okay, you got a fish. Then you're getting another fish. Okay, you're starting to develop a pattern. Then there you go. Follow that, I would say, for the rest of the day. Every once in a while, changing it up just to see if you're missing fish. But countdown presentation is something that's talked about a lot in trout fishing with sinking lines, but something that's also equally effective with even an intermediate or a floating line. Like I fish most of the time floating lines in rivers because we're generally only fishing, less than 10 feet most of the time. So cool. Moving on. Okay, so we're working our way towards bottom. I'm going to go into a crayfish fly because we've done a surface fly, bait fish. We're going to do 2 crayfish, but the first one is going to be this one, which is a little bit from an untraditional when it comes to crayfish flies because it doesn't have obvious claws. Everyone always talks about crayfish flies having claws, which is obviously a key point. We're going to tie one with one, but this is a fleeing crayfish. So it's tied almost identical to like a zonker style fly. But you fish this one a lot different than, let's say, something with claws like this one, which we'll go over. This fly is designed to be fished, generally speaking, on either an intermediate or a full sink line and fished right along the bottom in the rocks. Like strip this so it's bouncing off the rocks. You're going to snag up a lot, but if you spook crayfish while you're waiting, like if you go to the Grand River and just walk along the middle Grand, there's so many crayfish in the river and you'll spook them like crazy and they're going to dart and they're just going to swim backwards with their tail kick and their claws are instantly going to go forward and they're just going to look like a tail. So this zonker strip just emulates both of the claws together in that streamline kind of approach. Really simple fly to tie, which has had great results for me, but fished pretty aggressively versus the I always call it the first round knockout because it's kind of like a boxing crab, 2 little claws, where you're going to fish that on the bottom and you're trying to entice them into a fighting position with those floating claws. This one is just like, oh crap, you spooked me, I'm going to swim away. And you want to make sure you're banging these lead eyes off the bottom of the river. I did say, I only talked about sinking lines. You can fish it on a floating line, but only if you're fishing in like pretty shallow water, like 3 feet of water or so at the max. Because if you fish any deeper than that, the fly is going to yo-yo up and down. And that doesn't look as natural as the fleeing crayfish where it's banging into the rocks and kind of making a lot of sound. If you pick up a crayfish and like hold them in your hand and you get them to kick their tail, they make a really audible click with the plates on their I guess you call it armor, shellback clicking. Think about those hard plates running into limestone is what I'm trying to emulate. So these lead eyes just cranking off the rocks as you go. Even brass eyes are good because they have a lot more of a tinny sound and they don't have a dull sound like lead. But let the water depth tell you what you need to fish there. So I'm gonna jump on into this. Fleeing crayfish. One of my new favorite hooks are these predator hooks by Hannock. They're wicked sharp. They've got a really nice long shank on them for the size of the hook. It's a size 1 hook, but it's got like a size 1/0 or 2/0 length to the shank, which is great. So a lot of room to tie flies on without having to go to a big gape. So this is quickly becoming one of my favorite hooks in the last year or so. All right, throw that in there. And of course I need to do a thread change. Let me think this through. I got 2 bobbins. Okay. Yes. Get rid of the green one. I'm going to use an orange hotspot for the thread, or orange thread for the hotspot at the head. Not sure how key that is, but with crayfish, similar to your question you asked, Chris, about when you would fish that half and half, crayfish have a very distinct time of year. They seem to be on the bass menu. That's during their molt, which generally occurs roughly every 20 to 30 days. But the big one everybody's probably seen is in that mid to late July. It's kind of obvious. All the crayfish in the river are orange. And that basically, just like us, we love soft shell crab. It's the same scenario. Their carapace is so soft, it's squishy. You try to pick one up, you'll probably just kill it picking it up. But the bass love it. You know that when they're spitting up orange crayfish. It's not that they've started to digest them. It's not that people are feeding them cooked shrimp. It's just that the crayfish are orange at that time of year. So orange is always a good color to start with crayfish. I'm going to leave a little bit of room here because we're going to tie in some lead eyes. So probably a 1/4 inch or so. Tie in your thread. All right. So we're going to tie in a couple antennae, which are just contrasting rubber legs. Again, the squared silicone is my go-to. You can always trim them to length after. I want to kind of just slightly come around the bend of the hook. Do you fish crayfish flies like nymphs or streamers? Great question. You can do both. A lot of the time, people want to fish bass flies too fast. Like I mentioned briefly before, they're not trout, and like a big brown loves to chase a big zombie flugen or dungeon or something like that. One thing oh, come on, I'm talking and trying to tie here. One thing everybody can do themselves a favor while bass fishing is just slowing it down. So you can try going fast with these, which will sometimes work, but most of the time I'm fishing them like a really slow streamer, if that makes sense. So counting it down, letting the current add some action to the fly, almost swinging it, will allow a really nice presentation of it just moving along the bottom. And then one thing I'll often do with crayfish flies is similar to fishing still water with nymphs on a floating line or a midge tip or something. You're going to watch the tip of your line to go left or right when a fish grabs it and starts to swim away with it, because there'll be slack in your system, and that's when you know to give it a strip set. But you just want to stay somewhat tight with your fly, like giving it nice slow strips, leaving some controlled slack to get that ideal presentation. So we're going to wrap down the hook a little bit to let those antennae really kind of stand out and stand upwards. Crayfish always have a pointed section to their carapace. People will call them mouth parts. So I like to use Arctic Fox for that in a nice orange color. So we're going to clip off a fairly healthy chunk. And I'm going to remove, because they're unpredictable, I'm going to remove the guard hairs from this, or majority of the guard hairs. Guard hairs are the ones that are very long and stiff. They almost look shiny like that, compared to the curly under fur that you see in fuzzy material, which is a little bit more predictable. Surprisingly, it's one of my most used materials in every species of fly I fish, every species of fish I tie for, all the way from steelhead and trout to bass and pike. So the mouth parts, I only want them to be about a half an inch, maybe let's call it a half a hook length, hook shank length. I'm going to start tying them right in where the antennae was tied in on that slight upward angle by going around the bend a little bit, and then coming down the shank, tying it in, tight, and then wrapping back down just to really secure it. It's a really nice material. It moves really well. It's a really durable material. Trim that short. All right. Then I want to add some of the shrimp eyes to crayfish flies. I make my own, but you can buy them in a shop too, I believe. Melting 40-pound monofilament, 50-pound monofilament or fluorocarbon, and then putting some black UV cured glue over top allows a nice black eye you can see there. So I'm going to trim this just in half. I feel like there's a whole YouTube video you can do on making your own eyes, so I'm not going to make them in front of the camera, but you can totally buy them too. They aren't super durable, but they do the trick. I don't think they really matter all that much, but we're going to tie them off to the left and right, which is super important on the hook shank, not on the bottom, not on the top, and right down to those mouth parts. And then I usually give them a little bend and kink, which will help them stick out a little bit. You can also, if you're having problems with the eyes not going in the right position, you can hit your bodkin with a lighter and then press it against the monofilament where you want it to bend. Don't melt the mono, but that heat will allow the fibers to, the mono to run in the right direction. Eyes on crayfish are super obvious. That's why I like them. This platform would also be tied in a slightly different color, would also be a deadly shrimp fly. If you were fishing for like mangroves, like in the mangroves for like snook or redfish or something. Maybe a little too big and clunky for bonefish, but. All right. So at this point, I'm going to tie in the lead eyes at the back here before we spin up the body of the fly. Again, same principle as Clouser, building up thread dam, little ball, and then another little ball in front. And this one, because I'm generally fishing it in slightly shallower water than say, I want to be able to usually see this fly. I want to see it bouncing off the rocks. I'm generally fishing it on this size, one hook with a medium lead eye, not using too heavy of a lead eye. It'll get down, the rabbit strip will saturate with water. It'll really pull this thing right to the bottom. Has a really good movement and action. It really does, when it's moving, looks just like a crayfish who's freaking out. And when something in nature freaks out, it's usually food. All right. So, second last material is going to be tri-lobal dubbing in a dubbing loop, which I thought I forgot. Dubbing loop tool, but we're good. I'm just going to back the camera up just a little bit so I have a little bit more room to work with the dubbing loop. Hopefully it doesn't, I'll move it back in after. Hopefully that doesn't mess up that camera angle too much. I've talked about making dubbing loops and a few others. I think you guys even have a video online, right? Did I see that on your YouTube?
Yeah, there's something out there for sure.
Pretty sure you guys did one. So in a dubbing loop, I'm using a pretty heavy thread, so a 6/0 Vivas thread. I'm not too worried about. I'll say it now. I'm not too worried about thread breaking. It's going to break now. But if I was using thinner, I would double it up. And then for the body, I'm using tan tri-lobal dubbing. If you look at a crayfish, the belly is almost always tan or a lighter color of the shell back. So tan is always a safe bet. So you can pull in a pretty good pinch because you're going to spread this out like that to start. And then you're going to just start applying it little pinches at a time right up. And you probably want your dubbing loop to be about 3 inches, I'd say. Maybe a little bit less, because by the time you spin it, it's going to shrink in length. And there's nothing I hate more than having to do a second dubbing loop because you're short. It's not the end of the world. It's not like if you're doing it with a split thread or something, that style, where it's super frustrating. So that should be good, about 3 inches or so. Pinch the bottom together, start your spins with the tension. And it should start to spin. There we go. Get a good wrap on this thing. Watch out for your rubber legs because you're doing it in the wrong angle. There we go. Bring it back this way. There we go, that's better. Really get a spin now. All right, and then you're going to take some sort of a dubbing brush and just gently massage those fibers out before you start wrapping. Kind of just like a soft hackle, you want to pull those fibers forward between every wrap. Don't feel like you need to get super tight turns. That little bit of orange glowing through the body is a good thing, in my opinion. Probably should have just used the rotating function on my face, but that's okay. It's going to look kind of messy. That's the goal, not just the right amount. And then tie in your dubbing loop before you snip everything off. And then take your dubbing brush again, brush those materials out. Tri-lobal has a really nice sheen to it. It's got a lot of volume. Get that in there. But it's going to get super messy. So at this point, I like to pull all my material back and then take a longer pair of scissors and just add a little bit of a snip to it just to create a little bit less profile towards the eyes, creating a bit of a natural taper. Leaving those longest ones there, about that length, that'll give you a nice shape to your fly. All you need for the carapace is some zonker strips. I've used the Magnum zonker strips in bigger flies, but for a size 1, just the standard strip's good. And you're going to find a piece that's got no real twist to it, something that's got some good volume. Usually one end of the rabbit strip, like this end, has more volume. And as you get towards, I guess, the head of the rabbit, it's a little thinner. You see here, it's like not, it's hard to see on camera, but this is thinner hairs per square inch probably than down at the butt. You can feel it. And you want this to be, I'd say, roughly a ½ inch or so longer than the hook shank length. So that means the tips of the claws, which is just one piece, will be about the length of your antenna roughly. So you're going to find that point, which is roughly there. Part your hair. Give it a snip. There we go. Double check. Cool, I want it to be tied in there. That means I'm lining it up right there roughly, which is about a ½ inch. And that's where I'm gonna punch it through. Punch the hook through. Open up your vise, move it around the bend, put it back in the vise. There you go. Pull all those fibers back. I'm a little bit long, but that's pretty much perfect. I want there to be material. I'm not going to like part this material and tie in on the bare hide. I want there to be some volume towards the back. So I'm going to move this thread forward, trap in a bunch of those hairs. This is like, you know, improper zonker technique in a way, but it creates a lot more volume in the back of the fly here. And you're going to trim off that little tag here in a second. It's good. And then just create a nice little thread head. Get too carried away with that little orange hot spot, like I said. It's a pretty good thing for drawing their attention. With crayfish flies, it's been said before, and I'll say it again, biggest thing you can do is match your crayfish color to your water color. So if you've got like a tan kind of, let's say tan colored or Muskoka colored water, this rust color seems to be really good. If you're fishing rivers that tend to be clear, fishing a light tan fly, maybe the gold variant rabbit strip, that's a good one. And if you're fishing a river that's olivey green, fish a green one. So super deadly fast. You can see that profile of 2 eyes off the side. And those are just the 2 claws pulled together. And it's so simple, but when this is in the water, pulling it fast, it looks just like a crayfish skittering away along the bottom. So if you tie one big enough, maybe into the 1/0 size, you might be able to probably work really well if you haven't tried it yet, but sneak in a small rattle would probably be deadly. So yeah, super great moving crayfish fly. This one I tend to fish fairly quick, unlike some other crayfish flies, which I just strip slowly along the bottom or let the current do the work.
Really nice. I like that a lot.
Yeah, quick and simple.
Yeah.
A lot of crayfish flies, like one of the ones I'm going to tie, require more time, and you do lose a lot of crayfish flies, so it's kind of sad when you do. That you can fish right in the junk and not cry if you hook it up.
Yeah. I like your point about using a sinking line with that too, or if you're in deep water, just to get that angle right. Because you're right, like the swimming crayfish doesn't jig at all.
No,
straight.
It runs into everything. They smack. They're running backwards. They're swimming backwards. They can't see where they're going. They're just getting me out of here. So yeah, now, was there any questions about that, or what else should I tell you about crayfish? Crayfish there's native species of crayfish. We have a very invasive species of crayfish called the rusty crayfish, which has taken over pretty much every major water body down in Ontario, even into our rivers. They get quite big. So don't be shy to sometimes try a 3.5, 4-inch crayfish fly. It sounds wild, but there's big crayfish out there. I know on Lake Simcoe, for instance, I remember we're talking rivers, but the crayfish in there are huge. You could I think it's illegal to actually, it's funny, they're non-native. You're not allowed to transport them over land, but you're supposed to dispose of them if you catch one. So you could actually cook them on the shoreline as long as you didn't travel to your house with them, and have crayfish boil because they're that big. They're not little guys. Most of the ones we find in the river are native species of crayfish, which are a lot smaller. Oh, did I lose everyone?
Oh, you're good. Lost your first split second.
Can you still see my stuff?
Yep.
Okay, I can't see anything anymore. That's weird. Just maybe my phone. Oh yeah, I think that was it. My phone's just gave me the warning that it was dying. Okay, anyways, I can't see anything, so I'm gonna try and go along with this. That's weird. Okay, but yes, with crayfish, start off fishing them, if you're fishing one kind of like that guy, fish them slower along the bottom, talk about that. But that fleeing crayfish, don't be afraid to strip it, fish it, in this size, which is about 2.5 inches, all the way up to 3.5 inches would be kind of my max size I would fish it. And
I imagine you're going for like sort of medium length, like pulsating strips, not so much like a smooth presentation. You want to be kind of choppy.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, it's medium length and short, mixing it up. Playing with short strips, playing with long strips, all that kind of good stuff.
Cool. All right. Phone.
I don't know what's going on with my phone. It had a low battery warning and then it just shut the camera off. But as long as you can see it, we're good.
Yep, we're good.
Cool. So what I want to go about now is called the Ned. This fly, this style of, let's say, lure at first has been incredibly popular with stillwater bass anglers and river anglers that fish conventional. It all started off with a 5-inch Senko that was then clipped down to 3 inches long, and then they fished a lead-headed jig head in the front, and they let it sit in the bottom and pounded along the bottom. It is really made to imitate anything along the bottom. Most of the time, something along the lines of a small bait fish like a goby or a darter or a sculpin. and it's super effective. So trying to imitate that with the fly has been pretty challenging until you start using the Game Changer platform, and then it really starts to work well. So the one difference with flies versus soft plastic is this: when they bite this cactus chenille, it doesn't really feel real or taste real by any means. So I put a small hook at the tail too, because they'll suck it in just the tail, and that way you can get them there. But the cool thing about this is you can see there's foam, little spade tip, I think you can see, I don't know, on the tip here. Also, Chris, just let me know if I need to move my camera at all, because I just can't see the viewfinder. There's more foam underneath the body here to allow this fly to stand on the bottom almost completely straight up and rigid. It'll be somewhat on an angle like that. When you hop it 1 inch, that tail is going to wave and then float back up in the upwards position. And it tends to just drive them crazy. So it's a pretty simple fly. It's got a few different stages, so bear with me as we get through it. But yeah, jump on in. So the first hook I'm going to use is just a size 4 octopus hook. Nothing too crazy. And we're going to use black, but you probably want to use brown thread with the color chenille I got, but that's okay. Use black, won't really matter. Again, with the 6/0, 6/0, a little bit stronger thread. Don't need to play or don't need to mess around with it. I'm going to take craft foam, 2mm craft foam. I'm going to cut a little spade shape out of it. I think what you could probably use too would be like booby eyes or something. Probably work pretty good.
Yeah,
I don't like that first spade I cut out. Let's try that again. There we go. All right. And you're just going, oh, shoot. We're just going to secure that in tip and wrap it back quite a ways just to lock it in. Don't pull too hard on the foam because you'll cut it. But you want that just on top of the hook, just like that. It's going to add some flotation. And then if you really want to get floating high, adding a second spade over top, it's not a bad idea. What I should have done is glued them together first.
if you can, Matt, can you move the camera so it's aimed just a touch left?
Touch to the left.
Yeah, it's like that. Cool. It was just losing focus there.
Perfect. So good enough. There we go. Okay, then we're just going to take some root beer colored cactus chenille. Just pull off a small amount. If you have, we're going to use a lot of it, but if you try to use too much, it's just awkward to work with. So probably going to pull off about 3 inches per section to start, and just secure that in. And just no need for touching turns again. Just it bulks up quite a bit. Cool. This is also one of my favorite flies that I cross over into a lake with. So most people probably know that I have I guide a freshwater flats fishing for smallmouth. This is a deadly fly when you can sight fish for them as well. All right. So there's a couple different options for shanks out there, but I'm just going to use the 20mm fish skull shank. I do also really like their, I forget what it's called, but there's like an ultra thin, like, what is it, the nymph spines or something like that?
Yeah, and I think the standard fish spines are a little thinner than those articulated shanks too.
Yeah, these ones tend to be a little bit heavier gauge, but they work because I'm going to wrap a lot of foam on them as well to keep them floating. But you're going to engage that one. Oh, come on. There we go. Okay, and then clamp that in your vise. Now the trick to get the right action on this, because if you don't do what I'm about to do, you're going to throw it in a tester bowl of water and you're going to be like, oh, it just all lays flat on the bottom. But if you do this little step where you take, again, this closed cell 2mm foam and you cut out about a, I don't know, 4mm strip. That's pretty long. We're going to build an underbody on this fly. We're going to just shave that on an angle. Be very careful with shanks. When you get to this point with your thread, just bump in front of it because you'll cut them often where the material was cut. So throw that underneath. And then this one I like to cinch down pretty tight just to create a, I don't want to make too much bulk underneath. Now we're going to move it back to the front and we're going to do fairly loose wrapped foam underbody. With a little bit of tension there towards the end, just to lock everything in good. And then we got to work this thread to the back, but you don't want to go really tight, just loose wraps. And once we get to the back, we're going to add some tight wraps, and that's going to secure our next section of cactus chenille. You want to attach this to the hook or the shank of the shank, not the foam. And then back forward with just fairly loose wraps. And then continuing on with those fairly loose wraps through the foam. If you put too much pressure on this, you lose all the flotation capabilities of this foam and your fly doesn't perform like it should. So I'm a little bit short, but for the sake of the presentation, that's okay. Wrap that in, secure it behind, whip finish. One thing you'll want to do on this fly, just because it takes a little bit more time and you would hate for one section to fail, is just add a little head cement on each section. But I left mine in my super messy tying room where I have no room to film, so it's amazing how it gets cleaned up once a week and then destroyed every week. Come on, open up. There we go. All right, so I run the hook, the trailing hook, and two 20mm shanks, and then I run my actual main hook. So the fly should be about 3 inches roughly in total. Same thing, get your closed cell foam, cut off another 3 or 4mm shank slice, taper the end. This is a fly I've held pretty close to my chest the last couple of years. In this way of tying it, I've seen lots of other net imitations out there that are super effective as well, but this one, I don't know, I really liked. Come to enjoy tying it and fishing it. And when it comes to colors, I'm almost always fishing a neutral color, so brown, and olive. I do well in black too, specifically when the gobies are spawning, because a male goby goes really black. But I like natural. If I'm fishing conventionally, I love like a green pumpkin or a watermelon Senko. So that same kind of color process goes into my bass flies. A lot of the stuff that live on the bottom of the rivers are pretty well camouflaged. So this is like probably one of the simplest flies when you think about it. There's like 2 materials. excluding the lead eyes at and the hooks. All right. Now, so we got the main portion of our fly tied. For the hook, here we go. I really like this standard weight trout predator in a size 1. It's a really good shape of hook. I find it's got kind of that slightly inward pointing hook from the actual point of the hook slowly towards the eye. But we're going to customize it because I haven't found a hook yet that has this right kind of shape and angle that I'm looking for. So let me know if I'm missing something. If there's a hook out there, Chris, because I'll gladly take your advice. It's one less step for me. But we're going to use a lighter, because if we actually try to bend this hook right now into the angle that I want, you're going to end up snapping it. And hooks aren't cheap. Those Ahrex hooks are really high quality and they cost quite a bit. So I'm not going to mess around. I'm actually going to slowly just take a little bit of the temper out of the hook, just in the tip here with the lighter, so that way I can bend it without fear of breaking. And you're going to let it, we're going to cool it, and it's going to maintain its structural integrity for the most part. I'm not a structural engineer when it comes to metals, but from my experience so far, this hasn't had a negative impact on the hook strength or fish holding capabilities. So you're going to light the lighter, and you're just going to heat the tip of the hook for about 10 seconds. If it gets too hot that you can't hold it, you did too much. I don't want the hook glowing. That is definitely not what I want. That's when you're going to run into the risk of messing with the temper. You're at that point, we're only up a couple of millimeters, and we're going to bend that hook quite steep. You can see that bend is probably 60 degrees. And I know that Ahrex makes a 60-degree bend hook, but I think they only make it in sizes like 1/0 through 4/0. It's like a big predator pike hook. They make a 30-degree one. It's hard to get right now. I haven't been able to find it, but it's not steep enough, because I want this fly, when we look at it, with those lead eyes to stand up in that orientation, almost vertical. So that's going to be great. That's a good angle on that. And it's already cooled enough. You can test it like it's bending the hook, right? Like cinch that up a little bit in the vise, but like the eye isn't bending. Like it's still really strong. The key is to not let that glow red. If you start doing that, you're really going to mess with the temper. And again, I'm not an engineer when it comes to this, but I can imagine that the structural integrity of the hook is going to be messed up. All right, so at this point, I just realized I forgot a material. We're going to improvise with some 15-pound Maxima Chameleon. I usually use like a braided wire, like wire bite, because pike will love this fly too. And it's always nice to have a little bit of wire on your connection. But this 15-pound Maxima Chameleon will be totally fine for bass purposes. I'm just gonna thread that through portion there, make those roughly equal. And you want to watch that orientation of your trailing hook, so make sure it's in the same orientation as your front hook. And start tying them in. Another benefit of the wire, the coated wire, you get a lot of, I guess you could say, bite friction between the nylon coating that's found on those 7-strand wires. A little bit more slick on mono, but it does the trick, especially for demonstration purposes. But I will happily fish this fly. Still good on the focus and stuff, Chris? Or?
Yeah, all good there.
Cool.
I had a question asking, in your experience, which hook fish seems to take more often?
Great point. I used to fish this without a stinger hook. So that answers the question probably. I think they hit it, they suck it in, and they spit it out quick, because unlike a soft plastic where it's squishy, this feels kind of weird. And they do react pretty quickly. So that stinger on the tip usually gets them. It's also nice not having to wait for them to like swallow it, choke it down. But it's all dependent. Plenty of fish get caught on the front hook, but every day is different. So now I'm just going to change the orientation of the hook and the vise so that the portion where we're tying the eyes in is fairly level. Notice I just spin my hook around whenever I need to. I don't like to use the vise incorrectly or in the wrong orientation at least. Create those two little thread bumps. Again with a medium black eye. I always use a black eye on this fly just because I want it to not look like there's something extra there. Not sure how much of a big deal that is, but to me it is. I want this to just look like it's in the bottom, and oftentimes this is actually sunken into the bottom. I should mention, how do I fish this? What kind of rigs or line? I always fish this on a floating line because I want it to have a vertical jigging action when stripped or twitched. If that makes sense. I'm sure you could fish it and swim it. It would probably be effective too. But the way I fish it is really just right along the bottom, if that makes sense. All right, and one last chunk of foam to float this section hook. This was something I didn't do at first, and I noticed the fly would just end up sitting all along the bottom in general. So this little addition of foam throughout the entire length of the fly has been a huge improvement to my success rate. My vise is loosening up. There we go. Cool. And then make sure not to crunch it, get to the back. It's like tying a big grasshopper fly, foam fly. And then one last section of the cactus shell. And you'll notice, I didn't really talk about it, but I'm trying to build somewhat of a taper. It's skinnier down here and thicker foam up at the front. I do want this to have a little bit of a natural taper, getting thicker towards the head of the fly. Create that nice tapered worm effect. It has also, in northern lakes, proven extremely effective on a fish that usually isn't targeted on the fly as much, but walleye. Fished them just after opening when they're still pretty shallow, and you can access them with a floating fly line. It's been pretty dang good. So that's it. That's the Ned. You can see how with those changer shanks, it just moves really easily. Pretty easy fly to cast. It doesn't hold a lot of water, and this will definitely float in the orientation I'm looking for, which again is hook points up and this tail just wandering up in the fish's face. So I like to fish this with short strips, little hops, and every time you hop it, that tail is going to move a little bit. Also, don't be afraid if you're sight fishing and you see a fish looking at it, just to leave it still. Just let that thing just sit there and just like make them intrigued and let them nip at it. Because even if they just nip at the tail, they're getting that hook. And that size 4 back octopus hook is pretty heavy duty, so you can lean on them. You can still land that fish with a good hard hook set. So super effective fly. That is, it's really just imitating that Ned rig / Senko that has been so effective for so long now on smallies.
Very cool. And yeah, like you say, fancy looking fly, but not all that intimidating for a fly.
No, like there's really nothing to it. There's 2 materials, right? Like it's a really cheap fly to tie, shanks and stuff, but it's great. You're going to fish them along the bottom. You're going to lose a lot of them, so I try to keep it simple. And yeah, that's been a really high producer for me. Okay. Any questions about that one at all, or are we good?
Nope, I think we got all of them.
Cool. Yeah. All right, so then we're going to tie one that does a similar action, but combining crayfish and the Ned rig. So I like to call this one like the first round knockout. Kind of, again, the play on it because of the way the the arms, the claws will be in the air in a boxing kind of position of this crab or crayfish. This fly doesn't sit like this in the water. You can strip it and it's going to ride on this horizontal plane. And because those claws are tied on monofilament, they'll actually move in like a fleeing crayfish. And then when you stop, they pop apart. But more importantly, the way I fish this is I'm going to strip it to get a fish's attention. And once a bass is on it, I kill it and it's going to crash to the bottom and it's literally going to sit like this, like right up off the bottom, claws in position. And it looks like a crayfish that's like, leave me alone, which is the most common response for crayfish when bass eat them. The interesting thing with crayfish flies, and this might be purely anecdotal, but just from my experience, let me know if you've seen anything different, but most of the time when a bass takes a crayfish, it's usually down the throat. They are not messing around. They know that they have these pincers and they're not going to screw around. So 9 times out of 10, they'll sit there and they'll look at it and then they just pounce on it. And it's swallowed before you can even get a strip set in. So in saying that, a lot of my crayfish flies, I haven't talked about that yet, I do crimp my barb. With the style of hook I'm using, this is a stinger hook as well. It's got that inward turn, kind of like a Euro nymphing hook. You don't lose many fish, but you can get them out a lot easier without killing bass. So yeah, it's kind of a fly I've been playing with the last couple of years. It's a bit of a combination on a few different styles, I guess, but something that I haven't quite seen otherwise. And if you followed me long enough, you know that I am not happy with just plain old flies you can find in a tying book. I like to make my own. And that's the fun in fly tying. It keeps you on something new all the time. So shall we jump into it? We're going to start off with that same size 1/0 stinger. Again, it's a good hook. I really like it for a lot of bass flies. It gives you a good platform size to tie on. And similar to the fleeing crayfish, some of the steps are going to be repeated. So because there's going to be some similar materials, like we're going to use antennae, we're going to use mouth parts, Arctic fox again, but it's going to be in a different fly in the end. So the orange thread, because it's on the bottom, so it'll work well. Making sure I leave enough room at the head for some lead eyes. And then coming down and around the hook again, super important for where I secure my antenna. Let's use 2. There we go. I'm going to make this one like pretty much a fully tan crayfish, which would imitate clear water crayfish. Like most of our rivers are pretty clear water. So I'm going to use like tan or like a slight gold speckled synthetic, or the silly leg for the antenna. Tie them in about length of the hook. And then double them back around the other side. And then tie them both forward. Okay. And then again, we're going to use the Arctic fox and the mouth parts. And we're going to pull out all those long guard hairs again. Also one of my favorite prop materials for intruder style flies. I'm tying with rhea or ostrich, which isn't smallmouth, so I shouldn't be talking about steelhead, but I've caught quite a few smallmouth out of season, unfortunately, but while swinging for steelhead on intruders. All right. Before I get too carried away, I probably should tie in my eyes on this. For the sake of it, I think I'll tie in brass eye, which will be slightly lighter weighted. And it's important to have many different weights of flies that you have on you for bass, because they're not always on the bottom, and the depth of the water you're going to fish will vary. So tying the same fly in lead in a large and a medium, and brass in a large and a medium, it's probably a good thing. You'll notice that a large percentage of my bass flies do use hourglass eyes, though, so it's a material that I use a lot of. And especially with crayfish flies, because that just allows your fly to ride hook point up and not snag up in the bottom as much, although it will still snag up. All right, so for the body, there's kind of a couple materials you could use. I will use tan chenille often, but right now I'm out of that. And I didn't realize until today, unfortunately. But this is also another great material, just like a synthetic yarn for building up bulk on crayfish flies. But chenille works really good as well. I think it was maybe Nick Roman in one of his talks where he talked about crayfish flies generally are pretty, if you look at them in books, they're pretty slim, when in fact crayfish are pretty thick. So don't be afraid to make crayfish a little thicker. So I tie in like it's an abdomen and a thorax, like I'm doing kind of two sections for the body on this fly. And every time I come back to the back, I'm just gonna lock in a couple wraps. That'll just keep it from falling apart on you. You'll notice I'm building it up quite a bit. The next time you see a crayfish out there, look at your flies in your box and look at the real crayfish. Most of the time, the ones that you've seen in books and stuff how to tie are quite a bit thinner in profile. And then I'm going to wrap up a little bit just to secure that all in place. It's kind of ugly, but don't worry, it's going to be hidden underneath. Trim that. All right. So now we're going to build out claws, which I swore I pre-cut. Yep, I did. Awesome. So they're just saying 2 millimeter foam. I've just cut them into the shape that I like, roughly. Yeah, a little bit long, the one, trim that up. And I'll show you how we move on from this point. So I'm going to just do a little finish here quickly. Snip that off, pull that out. I'm going to take some heavier monofilament. This is 40 pounds, just bulk monofilament. Clip off a section. And then really cinch it in your vise, like get it in there pretty good. I'm going to even shorten that up a bit more. This might be a little tricky in front of the camera because if it's ever going to fail, now's the time. Because we're going to try to tie on those claws, right, like it's a hook shank, but monofilament's not steel, so they can kind of fold and mess you up. So we're going to try and tie that in right to the back. What I would like to do is not apply as much pressure and just give yourself thread to work with. So I've worked over it pretty good there. Take your claw, put it in roughly in the position. I see I sliced it. That'll happen. There we go. That's good.
And you said that claw was just that same 2 mil sheet foam?
Sorry, yes, exactly. Yeah. And then you're going to do a little whip finish around that. Oh, scissors are banged up on the tip. Don't drop your nice scissors on the floor. They don't work as well afterwards. All right, so at this point, I like to come in here with just a little bit of crazy glue and just secure everything in place. First, I'm gonna just trim that mono a little bit more. And then really just a little dab. Come on, there it is. Cool, and we're gonna do the other one. Usually, if I'm tying a batch of these, I'll do like 24 claws in advance and just have them ready to go. But I wanted to make sure and everybody was seeing how I actually just tie straight on the mono as well. I was repeating what I just did, so bear with me for a second. If there's ever been one style of fly, Chris, that I've never been fully satisfied with, and if any of my friends or clients that have fished bass with me before, they'll know it's crayfish flies, and I'm always tweaking them, trying to get something that meets my needs. So I've got it down to 3 or 4 crayfish flies, including this one that I think I could throw anywhere and be pretty successful with. Again, match the colors of your crayfish to your local water body. A little bit of glue. Cool, that's done. All right, so then you get back to this stage. Quarter turn too much. There we go. Start my thread in again. Bring it up to where I back wrapped on top of that yarn. Now you're gonna tie in your claws. I like the claw to kind of be facing, I don't want it to be like in a vertical orientation like this way. I kind of want it to be sideways so the fish get a good profile of the claw. I don't know how important that is too much, but for me it seems to be pretty effective. There we go. And it'll probably happen where you do this and you're going to bring a fly back and you're going to be missing a claw or two. The fish do tend to take them. Just bend that. There we go. Cool. About the same length roughly. Shorten that up. There we go. Although symmetry is definitely not important with claws. Most crayfish have different size claws because they can regrow their appendages, and bass do bust their claws off often when the crayfish gets away. All right, so one thing we're going to do now is kind of come forward a little bit. We're going to create a small dubbing loop just for the other small legs that are found is on the crayfish. Is my angle still good? My vise moved a little bit.
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. All right. So with this dubbing loop, you could use the same trilobal if you wanted. Just for sake of it, I like the look of the tan ice dub. It's a really nice color, the UV in it. We're just going to use a little bit. Not going to get too crazy. It's going to be a very sparse dubbing loop. That's just going to add accent to the body of the fly. Going to kind of use it like a hackle almost. Spin that out. And then really go kind of hard on it with a brush. Pull that out of the way for a second. Back to your tan chenille or tan yarn, or you could use dubbing if you really wanted to, use a whole package of dubbing. And back up to where the claws started. And do that. And then we're going to add a rib of that same 12-pound chameleon. I love using Maxima chameleon for ribbing material. I don't use it for much else anymore. I have so much of it from I used to build all my Euro nymph leaders out of it. But I don't really do that anymore. So it makes a good ribbing material. You notice I haven't included a shell back yet. That's still to come. Haven't forgotten it. Although I'm not sure you would 100% need it or not, but crayfish are always two colors, one on the top, one on the bottom. So definitely something to think about. And now you're going to take your ice dub brush. Oop, came off my dubbing loop tool. Come on. Whatever. It's already tight enough. It'll work. You're going to wrap that dubbing loop throughout just to add a little bit of, especially if you're using chenille, you can't brush it out to get that little legginess. You could probably do it with this yarn, to be honest. Probably don't need that, but it's not a big deal. And a little bit of orange is not a bad thing. There we go. Don't want too much down there. It's gonna be the action I want. Okay. Then for the purpose, I really like thin skin. Works great for nymphs, works great for crayfish flies. I'm gonna cut out a pretty good section. It's a fairly healthy sized crayfish. I'd say, let's do metric. Let's say 8 to 10 millimeters wide. And this is gonna be the whole shell back. So a lot of time people will tie in the shell back up here and then fold it back. I like creating somewhat of a point over top of the mouthpiece, just like a real crayfish would have. So let's try and do this in front of the camera a little bit. Let's move that out of the way. Gonna create a somewhat rounded apex point. That's actually pretty good. And I'm gonna take the scissors and just slice it down the middle. And you're gonna peel that away. Pull the vise back. Since I moved it, are we good again, Chris?
Yep, yeah, good.
Cool. And we're gonna separate that little slice on either side of the hook right there, roughly. Yep, that should do. You're gonna tie it in right there with a couple wraps. Then you're gonna take your ribbing material. The dark brown wire would also work. Don't get too tight with your ribs. Should be roughly 4 equally spaced wraps, roughly. Pull that up out of the way. Pull everything underneath. A couple more wraps in front just to give it something to grab onto with the thread. There you go. Okay. Now what I like to do is kind of finish the fly off here with a whip finish, and then I'm going to pull that thin skin around the hook itself and crazy glue it into place. So I'm going to make sure we're in camera. Pull that forward, look at where the thin skin hits the eye of the hook. Take my scissors. Hopefully do this without too much issue. Put a little slice. And then pull that nice and tight. Pull it around the hook. And then I just like to crazy glue it in place. I'm gonna just trim that so it roughly the length of the hourglass eyes. Come on, there we go. Cool. Kind of hides the hourglass eyes from the top. And then I often just pull this back, add a couple dabs of glue there, and push it down. Cool. That's pretty much it. Play with the orientation of your claws. This one didn't turn out exactly the way I want it, but not too bad. What I like to do at this point is play with some Sharpie markers. Oh, geez, sorry, moved the camera. Tips of crayfish claws are often orange, so just hit it with some orange highlights. My full-size one ran out of ink the other day, so I'm just using this very fine point one right now. You get the idea. Go all the way around it. And because these foam claws will float so well, it almost has that same action as the Ned worm that I was showing you before. So you can let it just sit still and it'll just drive the fish crazy. And because their claws are never just bare like that, I like to model them a little bit with a dark marker. So just trim the edge with some brown. Don't get too carried away with it. The brown looks good, and then maybe a couple little lines just throughout, create some modeling. And then usually like a golden yellowy orange too, just start to make it look a little more realistic. Anyways, and that'd be it. So when you strip that fly, those claws are gonna really come together on the strip, and then when you pause it, they're gonna spread out nice and wide. But more importantly, when that fly sits on the bottom, it's gonna sit almost vertical like that. Those antennae are gonna float, kind of tantalizing in the way of the bass, and those two claws are just out looking for a fight. So yeah, the first round knockout, I like to call it, but play with it. It's a super effective fly for me. Fished really slow along the bottom, just crawling it, letting the current do a lot of work for you in a river scenario, and then sight fishing with it as well. So kind of a cool one.
Yeah, I like that. It's cool, aggressive without being like crazy over the top. Find a lot of the crayfish that you see out there with claws and prominent claws.
A lot of them I think are very very large, and almost overkill a lot of the time. Like the average crayfish a river bass is experiencing is somewhere around 2 inches, 1.5 inches. Like they're not big. So this one's a little over 2 inches, so maybe a little bit bigger than a natural. There are 2-inch crayfish in the river, don't get me wrong, but it's that perfect size. It's not huge. It's pretty simple. There's just a few materials, and more importantly, I just care about the action. So it's going to sit on the bottom just like this. Almost like they don't care that this body is too short for the claw length usually, because those claw length would probably mean a larger body or a thicker body, but that's almost like it's just sitting in the sand or in the rocks, and it's just like, come get me, you know.
Right.
And yeah, if you feel a hit, if you actually feel a hit on these, I often tell people on any fighting crayfish fly, wait for the second hit, if that's a term that makes sense. Like you should feel a tick and then a second tick, and that's them hitting the claws and then them swallowing the. That's something you should be cognizant of. If you set on the first tick, a lot of the time they've just grabbed the claws.
That
But,
makes sense. Yeah.
but a good strip set instead of a trout set will only move that fly forward a foot, and it should still be a target for that fish. So,
Sweet.
yeah, cool. Any questions, or I mean, that's everything I got.
No, nothing has come up, but I mean, as always, if anyone wanted to reach out to you or book a day, ask a question
Sure.
about one of the flies, they could reach you at.
Yeah, so I'm available. You know, I'm really active on social media. The camera that seems to be working now as I wrap up. Yeah, I'm available at Smooth River Guiding on Instagram. My email is smoothriverguiding@gmail.com, or hit me up at smoothriver.ca. All of them are great ways to get in touch with me, chat more about fishing. You don't have to like book a day to ask me questions about my flies. Feel free to just reach out and ask away. I'm here to help. I just love the Ontario warm water fly fishing community, so I'm always happy to share stuff and what's working, and even more happy to, maybe get out there with you. So hit me up, or if you forget all this, go into the shop. The guys will point you in the right direction.